Welcome everybody who's joined. We're going to just wait another minute just to see if there's anybody else who joins in the next minute, and then we'll get started.
Hi everyone.
Just to say welcome to everybody who's joining. We're just giving it another few moments until we start, just to make sure that everybody's here.
Start.
Yep. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to attend our webinar on design for recyclability. We're really pleased to see that we've got a really varied audience from across the pack ecosystem, from fellow agencies, fellow consultancies, also packaging suppliers and brands as well. So it's really clear, but not surprising, that design for recyclability is a hot topic and one that's on many of our minds. And it's our hope that you leave this webinar feeling not just informed, but genuinely inspired to think of design for recyclability not just as limitations, but actually as a springboard for better packaging. So a little housekeeping to start with. We've reserved 15 minutes at the end of this hour, whereby we can answer your questions. So please do find the Q&A tab, and you can type in any questions as we're talking, anything that pops into your minds. And at the end, we'll get to as many of those as we can. And if you see somebody else has asked a question that you'd love the answer to, do feel free to like or upvote that question so we can see which ones are resonating the most. But in the meantime, in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be taking you through why we're here, why design for recyclability, the legislation that's driving change and the timeframes around those, so essentially the deadlines that we are dealing with, some of the most common FMCG challenges that we're seeing when it comes to design for recyclability, and then highlighting brands who are doing something really quite special within those limitations. And this content has come from what we think is a really unique collaboration between two industry-leading organisations. So by way of introduction, my name's Lucy and I head up the strategy team at Touch, and I'm joined by our founder, James, who will talk to you a little bit more about the organisation.
So hi everyone, yeah, I'm James, I'm the co-founder here at Touch. It's really great to be speaking with you all today. And for those of you that don't know Touch, we've been helping brands shape what comes next for more than 18 years. We work globally across categories from food and drink to beauty, household and healthcare and way beyond. And we've been supporting some of the world's most recognised organisations as they navigate the future of packaging. I think what really defines us is the way we bring insight, creativity and technical understanding together to create structural packaging experiences that work for consumers, for the planet and for brands. And so we're all about shaping things to come and giving teams the confidence to really make the right decisions for the long term. And it's exactly why our partnership with Eunomia just makes sense. Together, we cover the full spectrum from early insight and creative and technical development through to policy and systems and the practical realities that determine how packaging performs in the real world. So with all that said, I'm going to hand over to Shane, who will introduce Eunomia.
Hi everybody, I'm Shane Monkman and I'm packaging lead at Eunomia. I'm joined here today by Aisha Bapsola, our policy expert, and you'll hear a lot more from Aisha shortly. So just to give you an introduction to Eunomia, we're a world-leading sustainability consultancy. We combine real-world experience with deep expertise in the business and play a really active role in policy development. What we do is we help clients build systems that are circular by design, grounded in natural economy, and powered by low carbon principles. Our clients span the whole value chain, as James just described. And we've been at the forefront of packaging and recycling for over 25 years. But we also work really closely with government up front on drafting policy and regulation. And we're closely involved with the development of PPWR, which you're going to hear a lot more about. Very closely involved with some of the global EPR regulation developments. And most recently, very much involved with SB 54 in California, which again, you'll hear a little bit about. So I'll hand you over now and we'll start to go through the topic.
Well, just quickly, a quick slide just to bring to life a little bit more the value of us working together as well. I think it's fair to say that there are many, many complex forces that impact the success of a packaging innovation today. We're dealing with supply chain pressures, we're dealing with legislation and policy, but also having to understand consumer attitudes, brand ambitions, retailer strategy. So it is that combination of our creativity and our technical expertise alongside the science-led policy-driven expertise of Eunomia that helps us to create solutions that respond to all of these things. But without further ado, let's dive into the topic. And more specifically, let's think first about the why behind design for recyclability. Because beyond regulation, which we will get to very soon, there are some undeniable reasons why we need to act now. Firstly, it's thinking about the fact that end-of-life infrastructure today across the globe is simply unable to keep pace with the waste that we're generating. And that's evident when you look at the fact that less than 7% of all materials used by the global economy actually comes from recycled materials. So it's clear that these materials that we're using are not successfully making it back into the circular economy. And the result of that are scenes like these, mountains of landfill, not to mention the plastic leakage, the environmental waste leakage, going into natural environments, harming animals, harming wildlife, and harming humans. And from the human perspective, I think it's important to remember that although sustainability itself isn't necessarily a top purchase driver for our consumers, they still care. So in 2025, McKinsey's report showed that 42% of consumers in Europe rate environmental impact as extremely or very important, and they are looking to brands to come to them with solutions. And the thing with packaging is that for consumers, the physical packaging waste that's left in their hands after using a product and how they're able to then dispose of it and how they feel about that disposal is the most tangible way that a brand can express their commitment to sustainability. And it's not just brands that have commitments to sustainability, it's retailers too. And we're seeing retailers being more and more prepared to take essentially really tangible efforts to actually support and achieve their sustainability goals. Notably, being prepared to delist brands and products that aren't in line with their own policies. So we're seeing policies, particularly in the short term, really driven toward improved recyclability, inclusion of recycled content, also educating consumers on how best to dispose and also helping facilitate disposal of packaging waste through in-store closed loop initiatives too. But fundamentally, when you think that we're using Earth's natural resources faster than the Earth can physically regenerate them, it's clear that we can't continue the way that we are, and a more circular approach to packaging is needed. And so it's not surprising that we are in a point in history where regulation is about to put more rigor and more parameters around this than ever before. So I'm going to hand over to Aisha to talk about regulation in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Hello, everybody. I'm Aisha. I'm a principal consultant in Eunomia's policy and economics team. And as Lucy said, really, there's wide recognition that we are in the midst of a planetary crisis, and the packaging sector has a big role to play there. And recognizing this, we've seen a vast increase in the number of policies impacting packaging sustainability worldwide in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please, Lucy. This includes both economic incentives as well as sort of legal compliance requirements. Next slide, please, Lucy. And one of the key ones amongst these is the spread of extended producer responsibility for packaging. So extended producer responsibility is a policy mechanism whereby producers are made responsible for the costs associated with their packaging throughout the life cycle, and particularly at end of life. And normally what this would mean is that packaging that is designed to be more efficiently recycled should end up covering less of the cost than packaging that is harder to recycle. In reality, that can be quite difficult to determine exactly what it costs to manage a particular unit of packaging. And therefore, a lot of schemes also use what's known as fee modulation, whereby the costs that they cover are then adjusted in order to give an incentive to packaging types that are designed to be more recyclable. And we're seeing this more and more, with more and more countries introducing extended producer responsibility requirements, and then underpinning those requirements with incentives and criteria associated with the recyclability of packaging that producers are placing on the market. Even in markets where extended producer responsibility is not a new thing, we are seeing relevant regulations being made more and more stringent. So for example, in the UK, we've had a new statutory instrument that will require large producers to carry out a recyclability assessment of their packaging as part of their responsibilities. And those that attain the worst grade or a red rating will end up paying about double the costs that they might have otherwise by 2028. Similarly, in California, there is a requirement now for all packaging to be 100% recyclable or compostable by 2032. And anything that falls within that definition then has to pay fees, otherwise they lose their market access. Next slide, please, Lucy. And then coming on to the EU and the new packaging and packaging waste regulation that I'm sure many of you will have heard of. It's a similar sort of situation here where EPR for packaging is certainly not a new requirement in the EU. It's been around for a while, but what the PPWR does do is additionally adds a requirement for all packaging placed on the EU market to be recyclable. And for the packaging that is deemed recyclable and is placed on the market to have its EPR fees modulated across all 27 EU member states based on the results of that recyclability assessment. So there's a double whammy here. There's a sort of a risk of being prohibited from the market, as well as a risk of having to pay higher fees if your packaging is less recyclable than some others. It's also worth noting that even though the PPWR only applies to EU member states and aligned countries like Norway, for example, that this will impact markets beyond the EU, especially if you are, for example, importing packaging or packaged products into the EU, if you are supplying customers who have markets in the EU, for example, if you're distributing into the EU, this will have a wide impact. It's also worth noting that while the requirements for recyclability of packaging in the EU will now be harmonized across member states, these requirements are not harmonized around the rest of the world. And that really can be quite challenging, because it means that it's not the case that what's considered designed to be recycled in one country is then globally as well. Next slide, please, Lucy. In terms of the PPWR, the only other thing to note as well is that obviously the PPWR is quite wide-ranging. It includes a wide range of requirements associated with sustainable packaging design. So recyclability is just one of those. So there is quite a lot to wrap one's head around. I've also highlighted the key sort of recyclability requirements on this timeline here. You can see that the Commission, that's the European Commission, will sort of provide further information regarding the specific design for recycling criteria in 2028, after which the initial requirement comes into force in 2030. But then that requirement continues to get more and more stringent across 2035, 2038, leading up to 2040. So this isn't a one and done. things will get harder and harder. There is an increasing level of ambition to really ensure that everything placed on the market is recyclable to the highest level possible by the time we get to 2040. Next slide, please, Lucy. And what do we mean by DfR? So some of you will have caught on the previous slide, we talk about DfR, but also RAS, which refers to recycled at scale. And this just reflects the fact that not everybody has the same understanding of what we mean by design for recycling. Normally what it would mean is designing and producing packaging products with their end-of-life management in mind. And it's worth remembering that end-of-life management refers to the collection of that packaging once it becomes waste, it's sorting or processing in the right sort of facility or by the consumer in some cases, and then it's subsequent reprocessing and recycling. So it is that whole chain. It's not just referring to the end sort of recycling process. This means there is a need to create packaging and products that are compatible with the entire recycling pathway and technologies. And in some cases, people refer to DfR when they're thinking of what is technically feasible in terms of packaging that is compatible with a particular technology that may exist somewhere in a more hypothetical sense. In some cases, they're thinking further about what actually happens in practice and what infrastructure is actually available in a particular market. And then in some cases, they're going further and thinking about the scale at which this technology and this infrastructure is available. And this is why you then see discrepancies across different geographies, depending on what their waste management systems are capable of. And next slide, please, Lucy. And then finally, what are some common design for recycling criteria that one tends to see? I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. You will receive the slides later on if you are interested. But this is just a summary of the ones that you tend to see underpinning those regulations that I've discussed, but also underpinning some voluntary requirements that are out there as well. And the main point to make here is that this isn't a simple sort of thing. You do have to look at the interactions between your packaging materials and additives and adhesives and all the different components and how they come together, how they're used by the customer, and therefore what happens to them by the time they reach the end of life. Underlying all of this is also a sort of a drive to essentially simplify packaging, just to reduce the complexity in terms of the number and types of materials and components that you're using. But we'll come on to that a little bit later on. For now, I'll hand over to Shane just to sort of summarize some of the key commercial risks and opportunities.
Great, thanks Aisha, thanks for that. So amongst the complexity, I believe there are some real opportunities, and for early movers, there are some advantages to be taken. Firstly, reduction of cost and risk. So getting ahead of eco-modulation on EPR fees, potential penalties and barriers, as Aisha identified. So getting ahead of that is really important. Secondly, protecting and enhancing your brand, creating positive PR messages on the products that you sell. You can gain a competitive advantage here by moving now, and we're working with clients across the value chain, leading brands to develop advanced strategies and plans to implement these changes. And then finally, your EPR fees that you pay create investment, and that investment creates recycling pathways for your packaging. And through those pathways, that means you have improved access to recycled content. So there are some real opportunities to be taken by moving early. Lucy? Thanks. So as we've seen, it is complicated, but there are two common threads that run through global packaging regulations that are quite simple to understand. Firstly, packaging reduction, optimization, source reduction, whichever term is most used in your market. It's about using less resources. And then secondly, recyclability. Designing in optimization and recyclability are going to be critically important for you moving forwards. Just move forward, Lucy. So moving on to design for recyclability. It's about, as Aisha identified, guaranteeing your future market access. From a PPWR perspective or an SB54 perspective, those deadlines for action, 2032, 2035, really not that far away. And if your packaging is not recyclable, you're simply not going to be allowed to place it onto the market in those areas. And what will that do to your bottom line? Or what will eco-modulated EPR fees do to your bottom line? Lucy will take us through a little more detail.
Thank you, Shane. I think that really brings to life the fact that this is a design imperative, particularly in those particular parts of the world. It's also clear that it's, you know, with guidance in hand, it is within our power to make design choices that are responsible and that will result in packaging that's compatible with end-of-life infrastructure. But if it were easy, all FMCG packaging would already be fully recyclable and we wouldn't even be here. But the fact is that it's not easy. If it was simply about pure compliance, that would be fine. But there are some very real tensions between compliance to recyclability guidelines and the demands on FMCG packaging today. And for us, that comes down to the fact that packaging is so much more than a container. Today, it plays lots of different roles throughout the kind of packaging life cycle, essentially. Of course, we know it needs to fundamentally protect the product within. It needs to contain and preserve products, withstand global supply chains over kind of lengthening amounts of time and distance. But it also needs to play a role at the point of purchase to appeal to consumers, to ensure that it's distinctive, represents your brand, is visually impactful, and also helps work within category cues to aid navigation and to help with recognition. And then when it's in a consumer's hands, there is increasing expectation for the convenience that we've become accustomed to, but also functionality, and to be done within a way that's safe, and then for the business, created in a way that's efficient and cost effective as well. But actually, the way that a lot of these roles are achieved today is with a slightly more is more approach to packaging conventionally. So we see a lot of beautifully high coverage, high impact labels. We see glossy metallic finishes. We see complex material combinations that come together to create something that works really well or looks really good. We see small items that add that extra convenience or safety or security. We see hard to separate components that deliver reliable functionality every time. And we see increasingly complex layered materials that can perform from a protection perspective. But as you'll have gathered from Aisha's quick overview of those design for recyclability guidelines, a lot of those design choices pose real challenges when it comes to end-of-life collection, but also detection, processing, reprocessing into further use. And therein lies the challenge. So I think we need to really think beyond compliance. We need to think of design for recycling as not just a tick box exercise. We need to use it as an opportunity to, of course, work within infrastructure, but actually create packaging that still protects, still entices, still performs, and perhaps even does it better than before. So with that in mind, we want to take you through 3 opportunities. I'm going to hand to Shane and James to talk about these. And these are just ways of thinking about design for recyclability that perhaps goes beyond compliance and actually unlocks more opportunity. So firstly, we've got Know Your Reality, which is getting a clear picture of where you are today. Then we've got Rethink, Don't Reinvent, which is really working with what you have so that you can create solutions that are compliant in a way that's fast and smart without having to reinvent the wheel. And then we have The Future Is Now, where we're looking more to how we can build future emergent innovations into our design processes from the start. So I'll hand over to Shane for the first one.
Thanks, Lucy. So how do you transition from reactive compliance to proactive strategy? Well, it's about unlocking the early wins that build momentum and build confidence in the business. It's about understanding where you are today and where you need to be in the future. clearly identifying the risks and the opportunities that you face, and not firefighting your way to compliance, but creating a packaging portfolio and a message that you and your brand can be proud of. Just click forward, Lucy. Great. So practically, what can you do now and how can we support you? So firstly, quite simply, you need to act now. As we shared a couple of minutes ago, those deadlines and expectations are really not far away. So you need to act now. You need to secure your packaging specifications and your data. There's going to be gaps. The format that you need might be wrong, and there might be missing details, and you might even be reliant upon suppliers to gather them up. However, it's critical that you start that process now and gather them up into one place, because you need to know where you're starting from, and importantly, what you don't have and what's not detailed enough, and then create a plan for how you're going to close those gaps and get the data and information that you need. Just click forward, Lucy. So secondly, you need to understand the policy and regulatory environment that you're operating within. Detailed policy and regulation mapping is critical, as is really understanding that. Equally, you need to be horizon scanning, as we've seen, out as far as 2040 and understanding what the future means for you. You then need to do detailed impact assessments by SKU, by packaging component, clearly identifying the risks and the opportunities that they pose, and identifying where the hotspots are in your business that require your attention. And we're doing exactly this right now with our clients. Just click forward, Lucy. Great. And then finally, you need to create a prioritized strategy and a plan by SKU and by packaging component. It's about designing in that recyclability and moving beyond the theory and the understanding to bringing the ideas to life with innovative structural design and specification setting. And importantly, we're doing exactly that again right now with our clients and with Touch. Remember that competitor advantage that I talked about? This is how you leverage it. And over to James to explain how you do that.
Brilliant, thanks Shane. So as we go into the second opportunity space, which we called Rethink, Don't Reinvent, it really builds on what Shane just took us through there. So when we work with teams across different categories, one thing has become actually quite clear. Most of the value sits in optimization, not reinvention. And sometimes it's as simple as removing a coating, switching an adhesive, or consolidating materials across a pack. And those changes can transform how a product flows through recycling infrastructure, and doing that without changing the intent of the design at all and keeping it familiar to the consumer. It keeps costs under control, it keeps the pack recognizable, and it still delivers a meaningful step forwards when it comes to recyclability. It's all about making smarter choices, not starting over. So let's take a look at a few examples of how this is coming to life across different categories. So in this space here, which we've called single-minded design, one thing we're encouraging more brands to explore is, well, essentially asking, can this entire system be made from one widely recycled material? And the answer is increasingly becoming yes, because we're seeing so much progress and development in monomaterials, whether that's flexibles or mechanisms like pumps and sprays, through to actually harmonizing materials across closures like the PET closure you see there on that water bottle, through to things like making labels that are designed to match the body of the pack as well, so it can all be recycled as one. And what's really exciting is that these aren't seen necessarily as downgrades. Actually, they keep the usability, they keep the performance that consumers are used to. They just work better at the end of life. I think this is a really great example of how just small strategic shifts unlock those recyclability gains and allow you to keep accessing the market that we rely on. In this next space, the switch to paper, one thing we're doing more and more of is helping brands to explore paper as an alternative to perhaps more complex plastic formats, which are harder to recycle. And there are a couple of reasons that this really resonates. Firstly, consumers just understand paper. They're confident about recycling it, and that clarity, it really builds trust. And secondly, paper opens up a whole new visual structural canvas, whether we're talking about rigid board, flexibles, or molded fiber. It can create better visibility on shelf. We can get 360 branding and often a more tactile and engaging experience. But one thing I will say is paper is never a blanket solution. We always stress that it's really important to run a life cycle analysis or an LCA, because to move to paper has to stand up scientifically as well as practically and emotionally. But when it does, it can be a really powerful step forwards beyond recyclability. I think it's really important that we think about certain specifics like shrink sleeving. And I really love this example from Ribena, who really rethought the canvas of their brand on their bottles. Shrink sleeves are often seen as the only route to strong shelf standout, but they do create real challenges at the recycling stage, something we see repeatedly across all categories, from beverage to personal care to home care. And Ribena really approached it quite differently. So instead of relying on a full shrink sleeve, which you see on the left-hand side, they slimmed it right down and used the bottle itself as a branding asset through its form, embossing and tactility. They even introduced a prominent 100% recycled emboss into the bottle structure itself, which really reinforced their sustainability credentials. And they did it in a way that's really visible and meaningful to consumers. And the result is better detection in sorting facilities, a pack that still feels really bold and recognizable. It still feels premium. And it's a great example of what often happens actually when brands reduce a label area to help with detection. The underlying structure, it starts to carry the identity more and in a more honest and memorable way. And I think it's a fantastic example in this space. And we spend a lot of time helping brands rethink what premium really looks like, or what it should look like, because so many of the finishes that signal quality in certain categories also disrupt recyclability. And the tech and hardware space is a really good example of this. Amazon took a very different approach in this example here. Instead of the usual glossy, multi-layered packaging, they chose a fully paper-based solution with a protective recyclable coating so it doesn't scuff. And it still feels robust and it feels high quality, but it's far more responsible. And what I love about this is it doesn't hide its sustainability, it embraces it. And in doing so, it really challenges the whole category to rethink what premium can look like. And we're seeing more and more examples like this cascade across that particular category. So I really applaud them for their efforts on this example. And I wanted to share this example from a piece of work that we did, which is kind of related as well. So this is a project we worked on with Mondelez's brand Greener Blacks, and it really captures the idea that improving recyclability doesn't have to mean losing premiumness. Now, the original gifting range for Greener Blacks, it used mixed materials that made recycling actually quite difficult. And by moving to a fully recyclable paper-based design, we were able to simplify the structure really significantly. But what made the difference was how we used that simplicity. The layered board construction created a more tactile and wrapping moment. It really felt considered, it feels crafted, it almost feels ritualistic. In fact, it's exactly what you want from a gifting experience. So the pack became more recyclable and also more special to open. And I think this example is a great one to show how sustainability-led redesign can actually elevate the brand experience rather than compromise it. And it's something we're super proud of, I have to say. And in this third and final opportunity area, which we've called Design the Future In, really speaks to just taking a step back and starting again and thinking, what could a future look like? And when we work with organizations that want to lead rather than simply comply, this is the shift that they make in mindset. They start designing the future in. And that means not only solving today's recyclability challenges, but actively shaping what comes next. From emerging materials, new dispensing systems, thinking about refills, concentrate formats, all of these become part of the conversation much, much earlier. And when teams look ahead and embed innovation from the outset, you can eliminate waste, you can reduce complexity, and you can create solutions that just work better for people, for brands, and the planet. And it's where sustainability and brand ambition reinforce each other rather than compete. So here's a few examples that bring that to life. Now, the first couple are some things that we've worked on. This first one is a project that we worked on called EcoTwist, and we created it with John West, who are part of the Thai Union Seafood Organisation. They were previously using shrink sleeve multi-packs, which looked great, but they caused all sorts of problems from a detection and recycling perspective. And retailers were becoming much, much more willing to delist formats that really didn't meet their standards. So it was super clear something had to change. But rather than trying to rescue the shrink sleeve, we all stepped back and asked ourselves a different question, which was, what's the simplest way to hold these cans together without creating a problem at the end of life? And that led us to this EcoTwist example. It's a simple pair of aluminium labels that are applied to the side of a stack of cans, and it holds them together, and they get recycled right along with the cans themselves at the end of life. And what I love about this project was that how many benefits came out of that one move. So we have recyclability improving immediately. We saw an immediate improvement in operational efficiency. CO2 dropped, plastic was eliminated. And on top of all that, it's also the easiest multi-pack to open in the entire category. And because it's such a clean and distinctive idea, it became a really ownable asset for the brand, and a really great example of how solving a recyclability challenge can open the door to much bigger value. And this is another example of ours, and it's a project we're really proud of. You know, if you've ever fed a cat, you're probably very familiar with flexible sachets, you know, which are typically of a multi-layer laminate construction. They're really hard to recycle, and they're incredibly messy to use. And as a category, they've been around for a very, very long time, so no new news there. So we helped the team move into a fully recyclable pot format, which completely changes the experience. You know, it's cleaner, it's easier to serve. It feels much more like you're genuinely caring for your cat rather than just emptying a pouch. And what's powerful here is that it doesn't just solve the recyclability issue, it creates a whole new ownable space within the category, something that's more considered, more premium, and more aligned to how pet owners want to show that they care. And again, this is a brilliant example of how the opportunity for sustainability can redefine an emotional and functional experience of a product and create a completely new category that's worth paying more for. So we've been involved with and we're also witnessing a growing interest and developments in paper bottles across brands that we're working with. And they're still very much in their infancy, but they're starting to gain real traction across lots of different categories, from laundry care and healthcare, as well as beverages. And big part of the appeal is how they compare with glass, because of course glass does already recycle very well, but it's very heavy, it's very energy intensive, and it carries with it a high CO2 footprint. Now, paper bottles offer the potential for a much lighter, lower carbon alternative, while still giving consumers a kind of familiar bottle experience. There's also a brilliant creative opportunity here too, because paper really lets you play with texture, tactility, crafted finishes that feel surprisingly premium. And in the same way that Amazon example that we looked at earlier starts to redefine what premium looks like in tech, a similar kind of thing is happening here in the paper bottle space. And of course, the LCA has to stack up. But when it does, paper bottles open up a completely new, fast evolving design space that I think is full of potential. And I love this space in particular because this is a proper wholesale change, this reformulated for the future space. Because one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing is brands rethinking the product itself. And when you move toward concentrate or waterless format, it completely changes what packaging needs to do or has to do. You know, the coffee examples that you see here are a great demonstration of that. By reformulating into pastes or tablet forms, brands can move away from complex multi-layer structures into much simpler, fully recyclable formats like the aluminium tube that you see here or barrier papers. You remove the water, you reduce the weight, and you dramatically cut the amount of material that you need. And what's important is that it's not just a sustainability gain. It often creates just a better user experience, whether that's around clearer dosing or a much more much more cleaner use overall. And it's a really powerful reminder that some of the best packaging innovation starts by rethinking about what actually goes on the inside of the pack. Now, even though today's session is really focused about design for recycling, refill has an important role to play in that conversation. And a lot of the early refill systems that we were seeing on the market, they were really reliant on refill formats that were hard to recycle. And now those sorts of formats are really under scrutiny. So what's really pleasing to see in the work that we're doing in this place and the examples that are on this slide here is we're seeing a big shift towards smarter, more circular systems, durable main packs that are being paired with refills that are actually recyclable themselves. Things like paper sachets or recyclable bottles or aluminium cans, things that go straight back into the system instead of becoming waste themselves. So refills supports recyclability in two ways. It keeps the recyclable, reusable packaging in use for longer. And then it also ensures that the refill component is made from materials or as a format that can be genuinely recycled with ease at the end of its life. And this is an area we're working really heavily in. So in a future webinar, I'm sure we will go into much more detail around the opportunities and considerations for businesses looking to build or scale refill systems. So hopefully these opportunity areas and these examples that Shane and I have gone through have shown you that actually Design for Recycle obligation is actually an opportunity to go further. So the question is, how do we move from that intention to action? And what we find when we're working with organizations at many different stages is that teams generally want to do the right thing. They just need clarity on what to tackle first and how to move forwards with real confidence. And that's where the policy landscape becomes really crucial. We're all trying to make future-proof design decisions today, but doing that against guidance that's still shifting makes it a bit tricky. So to make sense of that uncertainty and what it means in practical terms, I'll hand back over to Shane. We'll take it from here.
Great, thanks, James. Really inspiring. So as you've seen throughout, we're operating with high levels of uncertainty, and not all of that regulatory guidance that you need is available right now. There's still some to come. Across the world, global EPR regulations are not harmonized today, so it is patchy and it is difficult, and those deadlines are really not far away. But if you keep the two themes in mind of source reduction and recyclability as your guiding principles, they will stand you in good stead as you pick out that path on the way forwards. Just go forward, Lucy. So where do you practically start? How do you bring all of this to a point and a practical action? Our one-day DfR pathway workshops are proving extremely popular, and we're running these with clients right now. What you get is access to technical and commercial context that you need to operate within. We will simplify and clarify the legislation that's affecting your business, and we'll deliver the consumer and technology insights. So you get access to our experts at both Eunomia and at Touch. What you take away from those days is a set of well-defined opportunity areas that you can go away and explore and set that path forwards. So I'll hand you back to Lucy to wrap up this section.
Thank you. And we've got some really interesting questions coming through. So I'm just going to quickly sum up, hopefully, through the combination of listening to the kind of regulatory framework alongside what people are doing, it's given you the inspiration to kind of rethink design for recycling is not a limitation, as I said, but actually an opportunity to do something better. And, as we summarize, there are different ways to do it. It can be first and foremost about knowing where you are. It can be working with what you have, but the brands who want to lead rather than simply comply are the ones who are really starting to embed the future innovations, future sustainability problems in their design processes today. So we've got some time for some questions. I don't know whether, James, you've seen any in particular that you wanted to address first. We've had a big range of perspectives, so thank you very much for everyone who's asked a question.
Yeah, so there were some really interesting questions, as Lucy said. Some of them are very, very specific, so I might stay away from those ones, but we will be following up afterwards for sure. There's a question here from Catherine Bridgman. What is the true impact of paper bottles? which inevitably need lining with the need to move to simpler structures? It's a really good question. And we're doing some work in this space. I can't elaborate too much for confidentiality reasons, but where LCAs have been conducted, we see dramatic improvement from impact on the environment from a CO2 perspective, and of course, obviously being compatible with the paper recycling stream too. That's not the same for all initiatives that we have seen. So not all paper bottles are created equal. So I think it just goes to show that as you move forward with any of these new technologies, new materials, new formats, you just have to always question because it might not be the right way forward. Hopefully that answers your question, but we can follow up on some more of those. Any other questions that jump out?
There's a question that I think Shane and Aisha might have as perspective on from Paolo. Is anyone building a general standard to organise or share packaging data across the value chain? And he's referred to something similar happening in the automotive sector, where materials and components can be traced.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question, and one that I would love to have a solution to, but that doesn't exist today. So there is no defined standard of packaging specifications that applies consistently across the world. So there's no silver bullet on the immediate horizon. But I know that in country and through different industry groups and collaborations, people are working together to standardize lots of aspects of this process and try and drive some consistency. So hopefully that will bring some improvements, but no, there's no big global single standard as yet. Aisha, anything to add?
No, agree.
There's an interesting question, or actually a few good questions from Bob Peoples here, who, and one of the ones that he's asked here is, how do you see chemical recycling fitting into this challenge? I think having sat at the Sustainable Packaging Summit recently in Utrecht, where we heard a lot of debate about different types of recycling, I truly believe that chemical recycling has a part to play, specifically around very hard to recycle plastic constructions like multi-layer laminate films and things like this, but more importantly for food grade contact, for those grades of plastic that just can't achieve that at the moment through mechanical recycling. So absolutely it has a part to play, but there is a lot of scale up that needs to happen because availability of tonnage of those sorts of food grade polymers especially just aren't available yet through chemical recycling. But hopefully we will see that scale increase over the coming years.
I also just maybe add to that, obviously chemical recycling is quite a broad term. It encompasses a number of different technologies, and so I think there are some that are possibly better than others in terms of their environmental performance and their performance in terms of actually giving you a useful yield percentage output. So it's a difficult question, Bob. I do think there are, as James says, that there is a role to play. It's just there are still some quite significant questions around exactly what that role will and should be, I think.
Mm-hmm.
A good question from Corey, and something that's always on our mind, is how can you discover kind of new innovations in sustainable packaging? It's clear we've shared lots of different examples, but it is a huge world and there are a lot of innovations happening and emerging every day. So I know that, Touch, we have an approach to it.
No, absolutely. So at Touch, we have a platform called Vault. If you're interested, you can go on the Touch website and you'll be linked to it. And Vault is an innovation subscription service platform, and it brings to our subscribers the latest and greatest of the innovations that are happening in the packaging space, from materials, processes, technologies. Many of the brands that we work with subscribe to this platform, and I know they greatly appreciate the intelligence that we bring through there, both from the curated content, but also the original content that actually Lucy heads up from our side. Besides that, I can also highly recommend going to some of the great trade shows and events that we've been to. I would, having come back from a couple recently, I've left pretty inspired. Saw some things I wouldn't normally see, so that's a great way of staying on top of things.
I also think that, what we find at Touch is that it's possible to look, as an industry, there are different categories essentially solving very similar problems. So they may be doing it in slightly different ways because of the product, the consumer, the context that the product is consumed in, but actually looking across to what other categories are doing. And hopefully by having a bit of a bird's eye view across categories in this presentation, there's a lot of inspiration to be had. And I was going to say, I was going to ask actually, you, James, Shane and Aisha, if there were any categories that you thought were particularly driving design for recycling forward in a way that people can take inspiration from.
I mean, just broadly, if you look at the food and beverage space, and I think the examples that we've shown here just show a massive renaissance in all material types. Plastics are going through a renaissance in terms of monomaterial, higher barrier, without having to make more complex laminations. Paper, obviously, as we've seen, from flexibles to rigids to molded fiber to bottles as well. And even metals are going a long way too. You look at the advancements in the way aluminium is being produced with lower carbon footprints, higher recycled content, made with renewable energy. I think it's a really exciting time to be in the packaging industry because, materials and those core materials that are designed to be recycled are just going through an amazing renaissance right now. Hopefully. That's my perspective anyway. Shane,
did you have any builds?
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree with James. I think he's offered a smart take on it there. I'd agree with every point. Just to pick up one of the other questions that's in the Q&A from Chaim Weibel, asking what is the impact of recycled plastics in the recyclability assessment, and does a high share of recycled plastics as input waste reduce recyclability via mechanical recycling? So as we recycle more and the inputs to mechanical recycling become increasingly more recycled plastics, is that affecting the quality? I think the answer is no, because we're seeing brands have 100% recycled content plastics on the market. So there isn't a limit on how much you can recycle, but having clean segregated waste streams and controlling the quality of post-consumer waste coming in and having tight control of the recycling process ensures that the quality of the outputs isn't compromised. So it is possible and people are doing it today, and we need to become much better at controlling it through those processes so that the overall brand image and aesthetic and performance of the packaging and quality isn't compromised by being high in recycled content.
I think, I would say the sad truth is we are a long way away from having sufficient recycled content in a sufficient scale of packaging that's out there to raise this issue. It might, if we get to a point where all packaging contains 90% plus recycled content, particularly, for some materials like plastics, this could then start to pose an issue just in terms of introducing contamination or legacy chemicals or, whatever it may be. But we are a far cry away from there, unfortunately. So I think, for the moment, it would be great if incorporating recycled materials was not at the cost of the recyclability of that packaging, if that makes sense. It shouldn't be used as an excuse to not also ensure that that packaging unit is recyclable.
To the note around, I guess, limitations on infrastructure today, Alex asks, talks about the concerns around a fragmented and inadequate collection and processing infrastructure, and asks whether, and I guess also potentially how, industry can engage with this topic and I guess push forward the direction that everybody wants, which is to be able to cope with the waste that we have. Yeah,
I think it's probably one for Aisha on her favourite topic of EPR and PROs. And
yeah, it's a big question. In many ways, a lot of the waste management systems we're working within are are broken. And that is why you are seeing a bit of a renaissance of EPR schemes and the way that they're designed and the scope and the costs that are being covered by those schemes. Because in theory, where EPR exists, the cost of waste management should be covered, but does that include, for example, cost of investment in new recycling facilities? No, not very commonly at the moment, if at all. So, you know, in terms of how industry can interact, really by supporting the recycling industry, by increasing that demand for high quality recycled materials, that is really the key thing that you can do. And there's a double incentive here. Not only can you help to make your products more sustainable by doing that, but you can reduce your own EPR costs by doing that as well. So it's a really interesting question. I'd be interested in picking it up afterwards, just because it's very complex. It's very sort of systemic. I did also see a question right at the very start, just from Paolo, asking about Turkey and Norway and how they'll align to the PPWR. So very quickly, just on that one, obviously Norway is part of the European Economic Area, so they will have to sort of adopt the PPWR in good time. Their timeline looks slightly different than the rest of the EU does, but they will have to do that. They're also given a little more freedom in Norway than other member states. So they have to be aligned and they have to do nothing that sort of conflicts with the PPWR, but they can put a sort of a, you know, a bit of a special Norwegian twist on some of those requirements. Turkey is a little bit different. So Turkey, there's no legal requirement for Turkey to align with the PPWR, but because it is such a sort of a gateway market into the European market, you do tend to see some level of alignment just for producers who are sending goods through there or manufacturing there or whatever. So there is some degree of alignment already that we're aware of and likely to be more in the future. But we can get in touch later on that if you are interested in more information, Paola.
Right. And it's important to say that any questions that we don't get round to in the next couple of minutes as we come into the finish, then we will follow up with everyone and try and provide answers to all of those questions.
I thought we could end on a question that, you know, we've talked a lot about the scale and the impact of achieving things at scale, and we have obviously referenced some pretty big brands. So I wanted to nod to Hannah's question here around, you know, how can smaller brands or people working with smaller margins for more kind of mainstream items leverage and move forward in this topic, because, you know, they may not have that benefit of economies of scale, of access. And it's a really good question. So I just wanted to know what your perspectives were.
No, it's a good question. And I think I would point you towards that second opportunity space, which is about rethinking what you have, because as well as brands trying to really move the needle, come up with new ways of creating advantage, what we're also seeing is mainstream suppliers really focusing in on, when I say suppliers, I mean packaging material suppliers and converters, really narrowing in on the fact that they have a huge role to play and they are perhaps the biggest unlock. So they are investing a lot in terms of development of materials. Again, like I said, that renaissance across plastics, metals, glass, paper-based materials that are accessible for all. And of course, some suppliers are geared up for much bigger organizations, but there are suppliers out there that are perhaps more tailored towards smaller organizations too. So of course we could follow up and we can have a conversation about this afterwards, but there definitely is hope to make this happen, because ultimately these packaging supplying organizations, they have to move with this shift in regulation and support these support organizations and brands.
Yeah, great answer, James. And I think the only final point I would add to that is that, you know, we talked about the two common threads that run through this of using less resources and improving recyclability. The first one of those threads, using less resources, should translate to lower cost. So if you're smart in how you deploy resources and strip back or minimize, optimize packaging componentry, or reduce the gauge of materials, or reduce the size of the overall pack, all of those levers offer the ability to reduce the cost of the physical packaging and give you that ability to maybe a bit of room to make different choices. So I think, you know, it is important to realise the direct correlation between source reduction, packaging optimization, and cost.
I also think that small enterprises in many cases have a unique set of advantages that maybe large behemoths don't in terms of innovating in this space. There are some great examples out there of small brands that have really led the charge and captured the attention, frankly, of much bigger organizations, and sort of set a trend in that way while staying true to their image and really building sustainability into their USP and their customer base. So, you know, it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. It is about identifying where those opportunities are.
Thank you,
Great point,
Aisha. I think it's
Aisha.
very nice to end on a positive note and an inspirational note. It is undoubtedly complex, and we are really looking forward to kind of getting into some of these more detailed questions with everybody. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this webinar. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to speaking with you at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers all.